Okay, so the Ryzen review is late. Now, part of the reason is that I was away on holiday when the samples dropped, but more to the point, when I received the 1800X and started to put things through their paces, well, something didn't seem quite right. BIOSes for motherboards were coming in thick and fast. DDR support didn't seem to work as it should, but then there was the real point of contention. In practically every synthetic, productivity and video encoding benchmark, Ryzen was well up there with an Intel chip costing twice as much, but the gaming performance, well, it just didn't seem to be functioning properly. And the chances are that it still isn't. But before we get onto that, I want to stress a few really important positives about Ryzen. Power consumption at idle seems to be better than Intel, and under load it's ballpark. TDPs against the 8-core Intel chips are actually lower. And I reckon that if you're building a PC where multimedia work, video editing and encoding are your primary use case scenarios, Ryzen is indeed the way forward. Now here's a quick example of this. We use Handbrake to create our H.264 and HEVC encodes. So here's a look at benchmarks where we are transcoding one of our 4K videos, the Rise of the Tomb Raider PC versus PS4 comparison. So Ryzen is actually faster than a stock 6900K, and despite AMD's architectural disadvantages with AVX instructions, the 6900K is only 11% faster with HEVC encoding. Ryzen is simply monstrous for this kind of work. Now I could go on here, but Ryzen's synthetic benchmarks, productivity, video encoding, these benchmarks across the internet are legion. Chances are you've looked at them already, and my guess is that you're here for the gaming analysis. But first up, a quick look at the components I've used here for testing. Now I'm using an 1800X in an MSI X370 X-Power gaming titanium board, and I've paired it with a brace of G-Skill Flare 8GB DDR4 modules, validated for use with Ryzen. C14 latency here and 3200 MHz frequency. This is by far the fastest DDR4 I've got. In short, this is a best case scenario for Ryzen with these parts, and if you're planning an AM4 build, I'd be sure that you have the latest BIOS installed on your board. And yeah, Ryzen is a bit of a pain with DDR4 compatibility at the moment, certainly if you're using an older BIOS. So yeah, I'd make sure that you buy a validated memory kit that will definitely work with this processor. Okay, so gaming. It's widely acknowledged in reviews that 1080p gaming performance is off pace, and the bad news for AMD is that this is exactly how we bench. And here's why. I'm interested in getting an idea of relative performance between CPUs in order to judge their longevity across the years, not just their performance today. And as you can see here in these benches that compare a big bunch of Kaby Lake Intel processors, the differential is obvious to see, and I think it does a good job of showing you the potential increases in performance you get by paying a bit more money. Now, producing benchmarks like this involves creating gaming workloads that actually test the CPU, as opposed to an arbitrary top-end limit set by the GPU. Now obviously those lines will close up if we use a less powerful graphics card, but in a world where a decent CPU should last you anything up to 5 years, I don't think it's a particularly useful way to benchmark. I mean, it's effectively a GPU benchmark then, not a CPU test. So my processor stress test technique is to overclock a Titan X Pascal, running games at 1080p, and so testing CPU load and system memory bandwidth first and foremost. Processor runs game logic and prepares draw calls for the GPU. Now we run at 1080p at ultra settings here in order to ensure that the CPU is running the top-end version of the game simulation and preparing the GPU instructions for the most detailed scenes possible. The end result is that Ryzen is competitive in some scenarios, but definitely off pace in others. But first up, an oddity. This is Cry Primal running on Ryzen with SMT on and SMT off. So SMT, what is it? It's essentially AMD's version of hyperthreading. Now curiously, turning it off and basically making your PC less powerful allows some games to run faster. In this case, Far Cry is 16% faster. So AMD essentially asked us to bench in both modes, but this isn't a cure-all for better Ryzen performance. Turn off SMT in Crysis 3 here and you lose 11% of your frame rate. And this actually winds me up a bit. The user shouldn't have to dip into BIOS settings in order to get better performance. In fact, AMD wants you to carry out all manner of tweaks to get Ryzen to perform better, like shifting Windows to a high performance power profile, disabling the high precision event timer on top of tweaking SMT on a per game basis. It shouldn't be needed in my opinion, and the user shouldn't be inconvenienced. But I did the work anyway. But let's take a look at some gaming performance then. Crysis 3 is a title built to scale across a massive amount of threads. You need an i7 to keep this game running north of 60 FPS on very high settings. i3, i5, overclock them, it doesn't matter, forget it. Now, when we look at Ryzen's performance, you'll see that sometimes it's faster than the i7's 7700K, sometimes it's slower. The end average frame rate is much the same, but Intel's 8-core 6900K about 10% faster. The variation between the Intel Quad and the Ryzen 7 is very interesting though, and yeah, we'll return to this when we check out higher resolutions. But no matter what you do, sometimes Ryzen just isn't at the races in comparison to the Intel chips. Okay, so Rise of the Tomb Raider's Geothermal Valley is a massively hard CPU workout, up there with Crysis 3 in stress testing an i7 or equivalent. This run through the village in DX12 mode sees an 86 FPS average on Ryzen. Not bad until you see the 7700K handing 126 frames per second, 46% advantage. So is single thread performance responsible here? Nope, the 6900K at stock clocks is 50% faster than the 1800X. Turning off SMT won't help here. The 1800X loses 9 frames per second by doing that. This is a multi-thread aware game that really should be doing better on Ryzen. Now here's another stress test designed to put the CPU through the ringer. Ashes of the Singularity has a specific CPU-based benchmark, and it is absolutely brutal. We're using DX12 here, and the 7700K is 19% faster, the 6900K is 32% faster. I mean, something's not right here when the Ryzen 7 is an 8-core chip. Now I noticed that AMD issued a statement on the developer's behalf saying that the game is being optimized for Ryzen as we speak, and there was a similar bit of PR from Creative Assembly too. But this notion of optimizing for Ryzen, it concerns me, suggests that back catalogue titles probably won't get that level of optimization and will remain off the pace. And how can we be sure that future titles will actually get that level of optimization that's apparently required? But what I do want to stress is that while Ryzen 7 may be less than competitive in many scenarios, it's not fundamentally a bad gaming CPU. It'll do the job for sure. So here's The Witcher 3. Yes, the 7700K and the 6900K are significantly faster. But well, Ryzen is no slouch. This is pretty much the most challenging area of the game, and it's handing in an average of 119 frames per second. So yes, slower overall compared to Intel, but still capable for the most part. And if we rebench at 1440p, the gap obviously closes. I mean, GPU is coming back here as the primary limiting factor in our system. This is actually how AMD suggests that we benchmark, but I still think that fundamentally all we are doing here is influencing CPU scores with GPU limits. You can see that here in the division, parallel lines essentially. The only reason our 1440p results are slower is because of GPU overhead. The i7 7700K is ahead on both counts. In Tomb Raider, 1080p and 1440p showings with Ryzen are essentially like for like, while clearly the 7700K has more overhead at both resolutions. But there is an interesting wrinkle. This is Crysis 3. Now remember the very different performance at 1080p? i7 or Ryzen would take point at any moment, but the end average was much the same. Well, with the GPU introducing a ceiling of sorts, the 1800X's higher thread count is producing more consistent performance, and overall it's faster. Yes, this sort of highlights how average frame rates really don't tell you everything. You need to kind of be in the thick of it, measuring and comparing performance in the moment to get an accurate picture. So yeah, overall then, you can game perfectly well with Ryzen. But I'll go back to the point I made earlier. The CPU you buy is supposed to last for years. I mean, there's still a big bunch of 2500K owners out there who are perfectly happy with their CPU, and that came out in January 2011. But the key to that CPU's longevity comes down to two factors. Number one, the fact that it was so fast for its time and it was mostly underutilized for years. And number two, you could overclock the hell out of it. Now let's go back to the 7700K. We've been benching it at stock clocks here, but we've actually been holding it back. Pair it with overclockable RAM, engage XMP, and virtually all Z170 and Z270 boards invoke all-core turbo, taking it up to 4.5 GHz out of the box on all threads and all cores. Now that is fast, but 4.8 GHz is easy with this chip. i7 6900K, I could overclock that mother to 4.4 GHz with no effort whatsoever. Ryzen, well, 4 GHz across all cores was the best I could manage at reasonable voltages. But here's the thing, the latest i7s are already pretty fast to the point where if you're running fast DDR4, increasing CPU clocks only has a fairly limited boost to performance. I mean, I may well be hitting the limits of an overclocked Titan X Pascal here, even at a meager 1080p resolution. Now Ryzen only gains 1 to 6 frames per second with its all-core 4 GHz overclock. It's enough to keep up with Intel where it is competitive, but not enough to meaningfully close the gap where it isn't. Now I want to address some of the theories across the internet kind of attempting to explain Ryzen's gaming profile. First up, memory speed and its impact on performance. So here's the thing. Ryzen 7 is actually two quad-core modules integrated into a single chip. The fabric that connects them runs at a speed that is directly proportionate to DDR4 memory speed. So the theory goes that faster RAM gives much faster gaming performance because the two quad-core CCXs, as they're called, can speak to each other, if you like, much more quickly. Now, yeah, plausible theory, but I'm not entirely sure I buy it. So here's the 7700K and Ryzen running with slow RAM and fast RAM. The differential is much the same in The Witcher 3, around 20%. I would expect Ryzen to benefit more if this inter-CCX thing was actually an issue. On the flip side, Crysis 3 isn't so sensitive to memory bandwidth changes. Faster RAM yields only a 4% uplift on a stock 7700K, and Ryzen, well, that's only 7% faster. I mean, bearing in mind with the 1800X we're comparing 2133 MHz DDR4 to 32 MHz DDR4, I'm not seeing much in the way of a smoking gun here. I just think that generally, whatever processor you're running, you really shouldn't skimp on slower memory. Okay, but the number one theory about Ryzen's curious gaming performance suggests that something is up with Windows Core Scheduler, and this is apparently borne out by the fact that Windows 7 allegedly runs games faster than Windows 10. Okay, so I actually benched 7 games across clean installs on both operating systems with SMT on and off. Now I did actually find 2 titles where the older OS was faster. Crysis 3 had a 4% advantage, which is, kind of slightly outside the margin of error. However, Cry Primal is actually 11% faster, and turning SMT off has similar results on both operating systems. Now, I do think that there is a core utilization issue here that should be looked at, and there's actually a killer piece of evidence that bizarrely is potentially quite exciting if you're thinking of buying a Ryzen system. So here's the thing, in the BIOS of most enthusiast-grade AM4 motherboards, it's possible to disable Zen cores, and if we select the 3+3 option here, potentially we are turning the Ryzen 7 1800X into the Ryzen 5 1600X. Quick look at the device manager confirms that we're running with 12 logical cores here, not the fully enabled 16. So the 1600X and the 1800X have the same base and boost frequency, so in theory we have purposefully hobbled our lovely 8-core chip to only run with 6 cores instead. But hey, let's take a look at the performance. It's quite surprising. Assassin's Creed Unity, there is no difference whatsoever. Ashes of the Singularity's CPU test, we only lose about 5% of the performance for a processor that will cost only half as much. Crysis 3, we lose only 4%. Rise of the Tomb Raider, the 6-core configuration drops about 7% versus the 8-core. And The Witcher 3, 4% drop only. Even a strategically shaved chimpanzee should be able to overclock to make up the difference. So on the one hand, the lack of scaling beyond 6 cores is yet another puzzle wrapped in the enigma that is Ryzen 7 gaming performance. But on the other, assuming this is indeed representative of Ryzen 5 6-core performance, well, that makes for a much more interesting battle in that particular market. But as promising as this looks, it is conjecture for now based on a cute motherboard feature we've been experimenting with, and we'll need a Ryzen 5 1600X to check for sure, and check we shall. But for now, I'm going to leave it there. The bottom line, for a pure gaming build at these price points, my gut feeling is that the Core i7 7700K is still the better bet overall. However, if gaming isn't your primary focus, if productivity and multimedia is your bag, the Ryzen 7 line is well worth looking at. The value there is staggering, and while it's not a monumentally awesome gaming CPU, well, you know, it's not bad, it's fast enough. The question of which Ryzen you should consider, well, that's a topic for another time, but in the meantime, please like, subscribe, and consider supporting our Patreon if you want to support what Digital Foundry does. For now though, thanks for watching.